The purpose of our discussion this evening is what role Britain must have, if any, in the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation. And I think it's right that we should debate it, because it's not an article of favour, I think, whether we should be in or out. I think we ought to discuss that and discuss what the NATO, our role in the world should be. And now is the time to do it. It's worth beginning, I think, to remember that NATO was formed in 1949. It wasn't formed in response to the Warsaw Pact, because it was set up before the Warsaw Pact. And if anything, the Warsaw Pact led with the Soviet Union was a response to NATO. It's also sometimes said that NATO, right from the start, was solely a military organisation. Well, that wasn't really the case, because NATO was set up to also be a bulwark against the spread of communism, but also the spread of possible resurgence again of militarism and nationalism in Europe. It's an international organisation, transatlantic organisation, to try and create the right climate for a new kind of world order in Europe especially. But from those early days, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation has gradually grown in size, so today it has some 28 members and has a really influential role not just in Europe but throughout the world. It's also important to mention that many people, because they saw NATO as essentially a response to communism, Soviet communism, when communism collapsed and the Warsaw Pact was dismantled, therefore many people logically thought, well, the reason for NATO is no longer with us. It should be dissolved as well. But if anything, NATO has actually become more important and developed its role extensively since the collapse of the Warsaw Pact. And I would say that although we can discuss what role NATO should have in it, it still has an important role to play, but it's a rather different role to what it's historically had. And I also think that Britain, as a leading Western democratic country, ought to play a role inside NATO. And I say that essentially for two reasons. Firstly, I believe that although communism is no longer with us, Russia, unfortunately, is a threat to many surrounding countries. It is a threat to democracy. I view with great pleasure the advance of democracy in so many of the old communist states. We've seen communism being pushed to one side and a new democracy developing in most of the former Eastern Bloc countries. But unfortunately, I have to say, what has happened in Russia is a huge disappointment. Because although we've seen the end of communism, we've seen the KGB in many ways still continuing in power and transforming themselves into a new cadre of leaders. And rather than democracy, we see autocracy in Russia today, personified, of course, by Vladimir Putin. But I also think there's another threat as well, and this time it's a multilateral threat. The changing nature of the global geopolitics necessitates us to share common values, to group together, to make sure we respond effectively about that. But I want to say, first of all, why I think that we should be concerned about Russia. Russia, I was driving down the VM4 today, and I listened to radio before. And there's a debate about how the Russian authorities are having new curbs on the internet. Because, believe it or not, they actually see the internet as an instrument for the CIA. There's an incredible paranoia in Russia today. We also hear and see regularly how democracy is on the back foot. We see all kinds of pressure on peace activists, on gay rights activists, on democratic activists, so anybody actually who has a word of opposition to say to the present regime. I think it's also worth making the point that Russia, in the old days of the communism, had a certain predictability about it. Communism, if anything, was a bureaucratic organisation. It did not lend itself to snap decisions. It had to go through a whole labyrinth of committees before any decision was finally reached. And there was actually an understanding between the United States and the USSR about what was acceptable, what wasn't acceptable, in part because they all had a harsh lesson to learn after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So though there was tension, it is always well understood what the parameters of their discourse would be. Things are very, very different now, because Putin's machine is extremely unpredictable. Nobody knows with any certainty what arguments are holding sway in the Kremlin, what personalities, arguments are in favour and who are out of favour. But I think what it is certain is that there's been a resurgence of Russian nationalism over the last few years. Not accidental, but quite deliberately manufactured and encouraged by Putin himself. For a number of years, I was a Member of Parliament and as such belonged to the OSCE, the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe Parliamentary Assembly. And initially, Russia was actively involved and members of the Duma came along and participated with all of the other parliamentarians. But gradually over the space of 3 or 4 years, they became increasingly distant and increasingly hostile. Not just hostile over policy, but hostile because they saw themselves as Russian nationalists. Others were involved in some kind of international plot led by the United States against Great Russia. And that attitude, unfortunately, is very much in the ascendancy at the moment and has been seen most stridently, I think, in what has happened sadly in Ukraine. Now, quite a few people think that Russia's response to what happened in Ukraine was quite understandable because, so the argument goes, NATO has been expanding its influence and Russia was understandably concerned that a country like Ukraine, right on its border, traditionally been a sphere of influence, would join NATO. But the reality is somewhat different. If anything, NATO has been very reluctant to antagonize Russia as they have seen it, and have kept Ukraine at arm's length. If anybody's had a more positive response to Ukraine, it's been the European Union. But even the European Union has not gone as far in developing a relationship as many would like to see. And I just put one example of a friend of mine, a chap by the name of David Clark, who used to be a special advisor to Robin Cook when he was Foreign Secretary under Labour. And he wrote an article in the New Statesman, not some sort of right-wing rag, but a New Statesman on the 6th of March 2015. And he said, and I quote, "The real story of European Union and US policy towards Ukraine over the past decade has been one of lethargy and indifference. The much-cited 2008 NATO declaration that Ukraine will join was a sop designed to make up for the fact with a digest-united membership action plan. The European Union Association Agreement that put Putin was induced Putin to get rid of President Yanukovych, triggered the Ukrainian leader's downfall. That was offered as an alternative to membership because the European Union had become too greedy and self-absorbed to contemplate further enlargement." So that's the reality in a rather convoluted way. Someone on the left, like David Clark, thinks the main problem is not that NATO has been too active or the European Union has been too proactive, but they haven't taken enough interest and allowed a vacuum to develop for Putin to take advantage of. One final personal thing I'd say is that I took part in a conference in Warsaw a few years ago. And it was a discussion not dissimilar to a discussion we will have about the future of NATO, the future of OSCE, and so on and so forth. And it was a very good discussion. But I put some views from a platform which some Russian members of the Duma didn't agree with. But what was interesting was that rather than simply put forward the argument, they came forward and actually tried to take over the platform. Now, that concerns me because I think it's indicative of the mood which exists, unfortunately, in Russia today. And I don't think we, as lovers of peace and democracy, can simply sit back and say, well, that's Russia, we're okay in Britain, let them get on with it. I don't think we can do that as internationalists, as people who believe in peace. I think we should stand full square behind those who want democracy and peace in the world as well. Final thing about Russia. We've all seen on the news their intervention in Syria. I think that is most unfortunate, to say the least. It's unfortunate because they're propping up Assad, who is one of the most barbaric butchers in the Middle East. And secondly, they're doing it unilaterally, without any reference to the international community, including the United States. They're simply doing their own thing. And my concern again about Russia is that they're not really concerned, ultimately, about the fate of the Syrian people, or the rise of ISIL. What they're concerned about is Russian influence. And that kind of attitude we've seen in Ukraine, and we've seen it in Syria today, and we're also, I fear, about to see it in the Baltic states as well. If there's going to be a flashpoint in Western Europe, it's going to be in the Baltic, because there's been a huge increase in Russian provocation really, over the last few years, and NATO and the rest of the states have responded to that by placing more troops to protect Europe's eastern flank at the request of the Baltic states themselves. And again, that worries me enormously. So that is one huge reason why I think we need to be involved with NATO. Regret that we have to be involved with NATO, but recognise this as a necessity for it as well. And very briefly, I'll just touch upon the other reason why I think we should be involved with NATO. And that is because of the changing nature of the threat to democracy and in some ways to civilization itself, represented by certain kinds of Islamic extremism. No one can possibly foretell what is going to happen in the future, but I think NATO, with its flexibility, provides some sort of arm, at least, for like-minded countries to come together, to pool resources, and if necessary, to intervene in the interests of peace and international security as a whole. We all are only too well aware of what's happening in Syria and in Iraq and what might be happening in other countries as well. But what is absolutely certain is I do not think that in this ever-decreasing global world we can simply stand to one side and let people fight it out amongst themselves. We are surely all human beings, and we share collective human values, and that's part of our internationalism, and something which I think the United Nations in particular is full square behind. So could I say finally that it's not my purpose to paint an overly black picture of Russia. I wish I didn't have to. But on the other hand, I cannot simply pretend that Russia isn't as it is. You know, Russia, unfortunately, sees weakness and sees that as an opportunity for their own aggression. And as we all know, the only way to stand up to bullies is to make sure that they don't have a chance to exercise their brute force. And that's the only way to defend peace and promote internationalism in the modern world. So that's why I say, let's have more understanding of the complexities of international relationships, but for goodness sake, let's not be isolationist, and let's not withdraw from NATO.
Well, first of all, I have to apologise because of my hearing. I realised a little while ago, about 2 years ago, that it wasn't very brilliant. When a woman came up to me at a meeting, and I was next to my wife, and she said, "Bruce Kent, I'm so sorry to see that you're getting so obese." I thought, how bloody rude. I said to her, "What did she say?" She said, "I'm so pleased to hear that you're still so interested in peace." I realised at that stage that I'd crossed a certain barrier, hearing-wise. So afterwards, when it comes to questions, either please shout up or pass them through the chair or whatever. I'm very pleased to be here. It's not the first time I've been in this room itself. I did some time since I was here in Wales. A great pleasure to be here, especially in the shadow of the Labour Party conference, which in a way is casting a new light on all sorts of old traditional issues. And I'm so glad it is, because Jeremy Corbyn happens to be MP of our church. And not that he goes to the church, believe me, but he comes to the church never asked, in a very humble and decent way, and usually you have to grab him from the back at a concert or a jumble sale and come and sit at the front, Jeremy. So we'll do that. And he came the other day and had a photograph. So I'm pitching for my own boy, as it were, when I think about the Labour Party at the moment. I think there's a moment of considerable hope. What I thought was interesting from the talk that we just had, of which there were very sound points, you can see how oily I am really, and how unctuous, very sound points. There was no mention at all of the United Nations, I don't think, not once in the United Nations Charter, or what the United Nations was set up for. What I did is sorry.
It was at the end.
Did you mention the UN?
At the very end.
Oh, well, I'm sorry. I probably thought I was a beast or something. I didn't pick up that. I'm sorry if you did. The United Nations Charter, signed in June 1945, had an overriding purpose. It's in the preamble: to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. That was the principal point. Lots of other worthy humanitarian efforts, and in many ways it's done some wonderful things in terms of poverty, the environment, refugees, and so on. But the scourge of war remains ever with us, and NATO represents a large part of that scourge of war, because it is, I've written down here to amuse myself, I call it a dangerous white elephant. It is a dangerous white elephant. NATO was called into being before the Warsaw Pact. Why? Because we were all told in the West that the Soviet Union was only too anxious to move into Western Europe and in fact take over the world. That was the common kind of Daily Mail, Daily Telegraph understanding of how our world was situated. Only in response to the formation of NATO in '49, I think we said it was, came the Warsaw Pact. But the language of hysteria didn't diminish. We continued to see the world as divided into goodies and baddies. And that has produced disaster for many, many parts of the world, where the different great blocs have worked out their differences through the agency of other countries. Much blood has been shed, even though between NATO and the Warsaw Pact directly there's been no war, there have been all sorts of indirect wars. But the most dangerous feature of this standoff, which remains to this day, is that despite the fact the number of nuclear weapons has gone down, operational ones, from something like 60,000, it's gone down to perhaps 25 or 20,000, I don't know, who knows exactly. And they are, of course, now held by 9 countries, not by 2 countries as they were originally. But the bulk of them are held between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, Russia and the United States, effectively. And people talk about this as if it was a calm situation, that if war came about, that would be a great pity, we've got to plan for it, as if there was no instant, immediate danger. Well, let me give you 2 examples of the danger that we have stupidly put ourselves into. And the first in the Cuba crisis, when the Cuba crisis was actually over, and the American aircraft carrier was busy trying to get a Soviet submarine to come to the surface. Very unwisely, they dropped hand grenades to indicate to the Soviet submarine that all was clear upstairs, they could come up to the top. The Soviet, not unreasonably, thought these were depth charges. And the temperature in the submarine was 40 degrees centigrade, and about 40% of the crew had already fainted. And the captain thought he was under attack. And the captain said to his other officers, who had the keys, he said, "We will fire our nuclear torpedoes at that aircraft carrier. It will be the end of us, but we will die for the honour of our native country, Soviet Union." Number 2 officer said, "Yes, you're right, sir. That's exactly the right thing to do at this time." Number 3 said, no, you may be starting World War III. And since the number 3 had the key, amongst the others, but an essential key, and he wasn't offering his key, and nothing happened. But that's how close we were. Imagine 40 degrees centigrade. Someone could have started a nuclear war almost by accident. More critical was the one in 1983, when at a time when Reagan was talking about the Soviet Union as the evil empire, etc., etc., etc. There was to be a great exercise in West Germany in September, October 1983, and the Soviet advance observers saw in the western skies 5 missiles coming from west to east. And there'd been much talk about preemptive attacks, and they thought this is a preemptive attack. At least the 20 in the bunker, about 10 people said this is a preemptive attack. We must tell them in Moscow, where Andropov was sitting, already in his dotage. The captain of the team there said, we'll wait and see, we'll wait and see. And it really depended on him whether or not anything happened. And after 20 minutes, it became clear that what they were looking at was some atmospheric condition that produced exactly the traces of 5 missiles coming from west to east. Breath of fresh air. He relieved there was no war. But that's the kind of issue you have with nuclear weapons. It's not a question of some future war. It's constant risk because of the possibility of accidents, miscalculations, simply getting it wrong, or accidental launch, of which we've had some efforts at that before now in the past. So that's the perspective I'm in. Why do we have NATO? What is NATO for now? Well, originally, allegedly, it was to stop the Soviet Union moving into Western Europe. That's what it was about. We had to be armed against these bloodthirsty communists. And a lot of people, including me, I think, believed that at the time. Now it's ludicrous. The Soviet Union no longer exists, and the Republic of Russia couldn't possibly move into Western Europe. It hasn't got the resources, it hasn't got the equipment, it hasn't got anything. Is it really, as the meetings have suggested, are they going to run King's Cross Station? Are they going to organise British Rail? What are these amazing Russians going to do when they actually get here? It's nonsense. It's a fantasy which has been presented in order to whip up that kind of animosity. So we've got really to rethink, even if NATO had a purpose at the beginning, and I'm not arguing about now, it's long history, that purpose no longer exists. And when I see on television, American, i.e. NATO, influence in Georgia, which they were certainly doing in Georgia, studying Georgia, when I see American influence in the Baltic states, imagine launching a land invasion, a mock one, of course, but a land invasion, which they did about 6 months ago, in the Baltic, with troops coming out of landing craft and rushing ashore. What kind of language is that for Putin and co, except to have introduced paranoia into Russia, which is what they're doing. The idea that NATO has stood back in a graceful, kindly way and looked at those mad Russians doing mad things. On the contrary, we have been poking a stick into the beehive now for a very long time, and we're now kind of harvesting what we've got. What are the real dangers today? There are all sorts of dangers today. The whole issue of, we haven't heard about it, I think you did make a brief reference, but Islamic fundamentalism is quite beyond the reach of nuclear weaponry, because nuclear weaponry depends on the idea that the other side is somehow scared of leaving this world and going off. But if you're actually only too keen to get to paradise, the sooner you get nuked, the better, as far as the ISIS world is concerned. It simply doesn't work in that parameter. And you've got to have an established state with territory to do something about. There are, of course, answers to the ISIS threat, but to imagine that somehow nuclear weapons are an answer to it, but the real issue is really what's happening in Russia, is, I think, an illusion. We should be opening up our arms to Russia in every way and saying, let's live together on this small continent, which is what it is. I'd love to see somebody offering Russia membership of NATO. That'd be quite good fun, wouldn't it? See what the response was. Rather good. I think it did happen once in history. Better still, dissolve NATO. We established in 1945 an international institution that's meant to be peacemaking in the world. Regional groupings are quite permissible within the UN Charter, but no military action is permissible within the UN Charter without the sanction of the United Nations, the Security Council, or if not, the General Assembly. That's the basis of the UN. There's only one exception to that. One exception, and that is if a country is actually attacked by another country and in self-defense until it can get Security Council to not to do something, but until it notifies the Security Council what they're doing, then it's legitimate to attack. We've just seen in this country passing over without a word of comment by anybody, really, drones being dropped on 2 British subjects in Syria. I don't know who they were, I don't know anything about their background. I'm sure they're absolute villains, they may be, anyway, but they're dead now. But we used drones to kill them. We took the initiative without anybody's international authority. What if someone decided to do that to us? We didn't like somebody in Golders Green or in Cardiff, and so they drone. Would we have something to say? I certainly hope we would have something to say. This kind of lawlessness is what has got into international politics, and we should be actually doing all we can to enhance respect for the UN Charter and for the dissolution of all blocs that are not subservient or not responsible to a United Nations organ, and NATO is certainly one of those. And I can't tell you, I don't know, this is a United Nations meeting, I think, I can't tell you what a sadness it is to me that the United Nations Association has sunk in numbers so dismally over the years. The League of Nations Union had something like 450,000 members in 1931 and 1932. 450,000. I think if you put all the United Nations Associations together now, I don't think you'd make 10,000 out of Welsh, Scottish and English UNAs. They wouldn't come to 10,000. And the British one, I have to say, and I'll say to their faces if they were here, but they run, the 2 major officers of the British UNA are actually straight out of the Foreign Office. So you're not really going to get radical views coming from the UNA at the moment, I'm afraid. Nothing to say about drone strikes on innocent or guilty people in other countries. Nothing to say. The one people who should be saying something are not saying anything at all. So I'm just saying now that I think the time has come for radical steps towards peace, to acknowledge one of the great dangers in the world today is actually social injustice. When we have 9/10 of the world in extreme poverty and 1/10 in great comparative riches. I'm rich when you think of I'm a British pensioner. I'm rich. I have no other source of income, but I'm rich by 3/4 of the world standards. That's the world we're in, and those are the dangers we face. And why wouldn't somebody, faced with all these nuclear weapons and other dangers for the major, why wouldn't they arm themselves? Why wouldn't they? I think it's astonishing that the Iranians have agreed to some sort of system. We British are about, without any public comment really so far, we're about to spend £100 billion on another generation of nuclear weapons which will last us for 35 years. Mass murder at the end of a rocket, that's what they come down, that's what they are. And we can tell the Iranians they can't have them. Why on earth should we have the right to tell the Iranians anything of the sort? There are all kinds of dangers in this world, and I don't actually think that NATO meets any of those dangers. There are ways out of the mess we're in, but the NATO road is a dead end, and a dangerous dead end at that. So that's all from me. I hope you would all hear that. Now you can ask some questions, and I won't hear a word.
I mean, one of the things I fear about having an organisation like NATO is not what NATO's doing now. My fear is because of the changes in the political system in Britain, which has made it far more undemocratic and has given the executive in Britain a hell of a lot of power that it could use at any moment. My fear is not some Islamists over there or some Russians over there. My fear is the English right-wing supremacists who seem to be arising everywhere at the moment.
I mean, firstly, right-wing supremacists, whether English or any other kind, yes, are a threat to our democracy, our country. And I think that one of the things that we have to encourage in this country is much more debate, awareness, and involvement in our democratic process. And I would say this, although I wasn't a supporter of Jeremy Corbyn and the leadership, nevertheless, I do warmly welcome the fact that for the first time in many, many years, there are hundreds and thousands of young people especially being involved in political debate, coming along to the Labour Party, then that can only be a good thing. And that's the way to ensure that the politics of the far right are permanently marginalised. Could I say this as far as NATO is concerned? I mean, I think that NATO consists of democratic organisations, democracies. And I think that it's important to recognise that I don't see NATO as simply something which is against Russia or anybody else. I see essentially its role to be to promote democracy amongst countries, not just its membership, but also throughout the world as well too. And I think, if I'm absolutely honest here, I think we have to get away with the old idea that somehow this is all about American imperialism. The reality is it's not the case. Well, the real world is, frankly, the real division is between those who believe in democracy and those who do not believe in democracy. And I consider people who are on the extreme right as being politically in the same camp as extremists of Islam, for example. They are both intolerant. They both believe in undermining democracy. And for me, democracy is all about the right to express your views, the right to free association, the right to have whatever sexual orientations you have, whatever nationality you might be, or whatever. That's democracy, and that's what
Bahrain as well.
Yes, of course it does.
So why are we supporting Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, but want regime change in Syria? I mean, what is the difference between?
But I would like to see democratic change taking place in Syria and in Saudi Arabia, certainly. And there's no question about that. I mean, you don't find any of us being apologists for regimes in Saudi Arabia or Bahrain or whatever. As I say, the situation in Syria is when you have an absolutely horrific civil war. And that's the difference between Syria and the other countries. Not a question of democracy there. It's a question of whether or not we stand to one side and allow the bloodbath which is happening before our very eyes to continue without doing nothing. And I think it's absolutely important that we don't rely on the route taken by the Russians, but actually we are strongly supportive of international diplomacy, as Corbyn himself has said, and also, if there is deemed a need for military action, it be done with the authority of the United Nations.
Which was, I think the original question was around...
No, you've had a question, you've been quiet. I think the democratic issue is a very important one. What democratic control have you or I got over what NATO does or doesn't do? Has anybody here voted for who is the Secretary General of NATO? Have we any say over NATO? None whatever. It's a total illusion. Have we any say over the military actions taken by our government? No. Hardly any. Hardly any in practice. It comes down to it. As you know, what's his name? Blair, blessed memory. Blair, again, in the face of major opposition around the country, conducted his Iraq war on the basis of a lie, that we could be attacked within 15 minutes with nuclear weapons by Iraq. Absolute rubbish. I think it was short of the word 4 letters beginning with S. But anyway, it's an illusion that we have at the moment. Maybe, I hope, under the new direction of your party, there will be something. But let me talk about democracy as well. I think it's completely unfair, and nobody seems to notice in this country, that UKIP got 4 million votes, 4 million supporters, got 1 member of parliament. It's not fair. If we want to have a democracy in which different views are expressed, then we've got to hear the views we don't want to hear as well, and have them some sort of vote. And it's not coming. So I think that we have a lot to do domestically before we point too many fingers at other countries.
Next question, please. Yes.
Yeah, just interested to see what the two panelists think. If we were to dissolve NATO tomorrow, what the Russian reaction would be immediately?
Depends how we did it, I think. If we dissolve I don't think anything can happen tomorrow. Life doesn't operate like that. But if we started making peaceful gestures to Russia, suggesting cooperation in all sorts of different areas, inviting people over here on cultural trips, beginning to reduce the temperature, removing a NATO basis from SAP up in front of the Soviet Union or Russia, I think it would turn the tide of opinion, that's all. I can't forecast the future, but you can't make friends with someone when you're waving a fist under his nose. And that's what we're effectively doing with NATO.
What I think will happen, first of all, we've seen Russia invading Crimea totally illegally. And we'll see a bit of Russian involvement in the rest of Ukraine and possibly a Russian takeover of much of the country. You'll also see Russian action in the Baltic as well too. They've already made diplomatic overtures to say that some of the islands belonging to Estonia should belong to them. I think if NATO said we simply disbanding and say, hey chaps, let's go in. That's the real world.
You mean going in invade?
Yes.
Western Europe?
No. Remember, what they would do is reassert the sphere of influence. They think they've lost on the Soviet Union. They would be back in Ukraine. They'd be back in Belarus. They'd be back in the Baltics. That's what would happen.
You disagree, Bruce?
Yeah, I do. Absolutely. Why don't you go with a few carrots rather than the sticks? Suggest more cooperation, possible opening into the European Union, or whatever. If they're all part of the European scene, they should be.
Look, we had this debate in the 1930s, right? George Lansbury, leader of the Labour Party, thought that the Nazis weren't that bad, really. Have a reasonable discussion and hold a few carrots, have a good dialogue. What happened? Well, we all know what happened.
Why did it happen? Excuse me. The 1932 debate and discussion in Geneva at the League of Nations, the one thing we blocked was the control of navies. We were going to have the biggest navy in the world, and we continued, and Hitler was delighted. He continued, there was no arms agreement, and Hitler went right ahead. This country was very much responsible for the rise of Hitler. One ought to know the history of these things.
Failed to disagree with Bruce the whole time, I failed to agree with Wayne the whole time.
And things haven't changed.
Things haven't changed. I was just hoping that today would be different. Go back to Eisenhower, said warned about the growing influence of the military-industrial complex. He was worried about the fact that because military people want to sell arms, they create problems to justify their existence and such stuff. I think NATO is the peak expression of that. And I'm really quite surprised, Wayne, that you have got what seems to me a myopic view of things. Because part of the Western outlook has been regime change. It happened in Iraq, it happened in Libya, it happened in Syria, but it's not happened in Saudi Arabia, it's not happened in Bahrain. What we have got is a partial view, your partial view, of the world which justifies, for instance, the Saudi Arabian bombing which is taking place, murdering hundreds every week there, which you don't mention.
If I could stop you there, John, and just give Wayne an opportunity to respond.
I will. Just one last thing.
No.
I will just say, and if we're worried about ISIS, well, our NATO ally, Turkey, is responsible for millions of dollars a week in terms of oil revenue, which is financing ISIS. We should be able to do something about ISIS through NATO, and it doesn't necessarily involve bombing.
Well, you'd be surprised to hear that you will not agree with me, but I agree with much as you've said. Because, I mean, I think, for example, what happened in Iraq was absolutely wrong. And I've gone on record as saying that. Because, and I voted in favour of military action in Iraq, because it had presented to us that there was overwhelming evidence, secret dossiers. The Prime Minister says, I said, I've seen things as Prime Minister of this country. You must trust me that this country is under threat and other countries are under threat. Saddam himself said there were weapons of mass destruction there. Therefore, there was a case for intervention on that basis. As we all know, there were no weapons of mass destruction. But I've got to say, if I had that situation over again, I probably would have voted in favour again. Because we all got lessons to learn. But in that situation, if you are presented with information, parliamentarians, Privy Council bases, had access to information from intelligence services that said they're weapons of mass destruction. As I say, Saddam himself said they're weapons of mass destruction, which he was prepared to use and had used them against the Kurds himself. There was a case, we thought, on the basis of humanitarian decency to be involved. And we all know it's a false prospectus, therefore it was wrong. Could I say, as far as Libya is concerned, I think what's happened in Libya has been an absolute disaster, undoubtedly. And I think it's actually despicable the way that the Saudis are quietly, not quietly, we all know about it, financing ISIL, and that must be stopped, and there must be much stronger action taken against that. And we all know why there must be strong action, because of oil. Undoubtedly the case. But nevertheless, that doesn't negate what I said about Russia and other threats which exist. But what I'm saying is that perhaps those sorts of arms should be forcefully put inside NATO. And perhaps we haven't done it as effectively as we might have done in the past.
I could just briefly abuse my position as chair and ask the question to follow up on that. You've mentioned some of the faults of NATO. What does make you think NATO is the right organisation to challenge the threats that you mentioned of Russia and ISIL?
Frankly, because that's the only organisation that we've got. And the real world is sometimes you have to accept an organisation which exists, warts and all, rather than allow yourself to be vulnerable to all sorts of extraneous threats.
We have got something called the United Nations.
Yeah.
Underfunded, undersupported, totally ignorant about it. You can't even get a copy of the Charter now. You have to go to Brussels to get a copy of the Charter. We are not interested in the international peacemaking body, justice-making body that we set up in 1945. We are not interested, and nor are politicians interested at all.
How do you see the role of the UN, just to follow up on that stream, and then I'll ask the
Well, I think it's absolutely vital that the United Nations has a much bigger role, undoubtedly the case. But the reality is, if you look at Ukraine, for example, what has the United Nations done with regard to the invasion of Crimea by Russia? Absolutely nothing. You know, the Security Council.
What did you do about the invasion of Grenada by the United States? Nothing. The United Nations is not geared up to take military action. It isn't. It's been prevented from doing that.
But in other words, I mean, what you say, the Russians have done that against international law. Oh dear, very, very sorry, don't do it next time. That's not the real, you have to stand up and defend democracy. Otherwise, the bad people in this world will walk all over you.
Oh, the bad people. You know who the bad people are.
That's one.
Well, we've got a pretty good idea, yes.
Look, that's good. Yeah, not us. Not us.
People in Crimea wanted to unite with Russia because, of course, they had a lot of roots from Russia. The idea that somehow Russia invaded Crimea,
That's absolute nonsense.
it is, you're right, it's absolute nonsense. They didn't.
They did.
Now, talking of democracy, I'm wondering, you said a lot of things about democracy, but while I'm just speaking, I was brought up in the United Kingdom where I didn't have a vote till past 21. I was constricted to fight in wars that were frankly immoral. Why don't we have a little bit of talk about morality and the morality of the UN? Not a dominated war band, which NATO is, where they've got 30 trillion budget, and they want us to spend more than our 2% GDP. We're talking about 21 billion for aircraft carriers we haven't got the planes for, or the troops to man. For what? Who are we defending ourselves from? I'm not afraid of Russia.
So we had a doctor in that.
I'm afraid of the United States of America and the lack of democracy in Britain. I don't see democracy in Britain.
Okay, if I would just ask, so,
Sorry.
is there
We're on a different side, brother.
Have you comment?
No, we're not. We're in the common humanity side.
Ah, now then we're talking.
Traditional forces, or with separatist movements like the Russian separatists in Ukraine, say they are invading due to a democratic referendum, but the people voted at gunpoint.
Well, do we have a great respect for borders? Do we? What happened to Serbia? What happened to Serbia? How many countries are there now? We went in, we put a stick in the pie, we stirred it up, and now we've got Croatia, we've got Slovakia, Serbia, and one of the other ones at the bottom, Kosovo, I think, as well. Well, it's in our interest. I don't think this partisan business helps. I don't think that NATO was set up to rule the world. NATO was set up for a specific purpose, to keep the Soviet army out of Western Europe. That's what it was for. It's done its job, if that was its job. Finished. Let us look to the organisation we set up, the United Nations, to do this properly. And let's be honest in our judgments. And the idea of the occupation of Ukraine, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Empire until 50 years ago, and Khrushchev, in a drunken moment, handed it over to the new Ukraine. I had no idea that he was handing it over to a hostile neighbouring state. I don't defend it, but that's the background. It's like someone giving the Isle of Wight independence and then regretting it later on, which is what's happened.
Can I just mention reference being made to Serbia? Just remember, a few years ago, in the early 1990s, there was the most horrific genocide taking place in Europe, in the Balkans. Remember Kosovo? If it wasn't for action by NATO against Milosevic, there would be hundreds of thousands of more people butchered and walked in Europe. But mistakes were made, undoubtedly, in terms of Iraq. But let's not tar everything with the same brush. That was action which was justified and right. And I think that we are foolish if we simply say we can pretend everybody can be reasonable and nice. Milosevic, when they were allowing the butchering of thousands upon thousands of people in Kosovo for ethnic cleansing, absolutely appalling.
This is history.
Yeah, but it's relevant. We learn from history.
It's not history, it's your history. He wasn't a nice man, he was a very nasty man.
But you can't deny there were thousands of Albanians being massacred in Kosovo, and if it wasn't for NATO, there'd be even more people massacred.
There's something like 1 million people killed in Iraq as a result of our activities. I mean, are we going to weigh up on scales of the past, or actually work towards the future, a different future? That's what matters.
Yeah, another question.
Actually, I just wanted to know how we can ever, NATO nations can ever apologize to Iraq and to Afghanistan for the state that this country, both these countries are in now, whether they're going to be like that for a very long time, thanks to the work of NATO. So how are we going to do, how are we going to apologize to the men, women and children of Iraq and Afghanistan for what we've done to their country?
Well, apologies don't help much. What helps more is physical aid and assistance, and that's really what we need. I think what we need most of all is serious international education. Totally lacking in our
the point I'm
education
making is our arrogance. The point I'm making is the arrogance of the West. This whole thing of democracy, and then going about destroying other countries, long distance. That's what I'm making the point about.
I think if we're going to move forwards, we're going to have to stop pointing fingers at each other and saying this is what awful thing you did in the past. We've got to build the structures of a world where, whatever it is now, 8 billion people can live together. That's what we need, and that was the vision of the UN when it started, and that's what we should work for. And it's absolutely pathetic at the moment when you look at the actual operation of the voluntary bodies supporting the United Nations. They're either taken over by their governments, like ours, or they're silent. Basic education. Going to a school, I went to a school the other day, I said, how many of you have ever seen the UN Charter? Not one student in a top-level private school, 100 pupils present, not one of them had even seen the United Nations Charter. That's what we live in. It's like driving your car without any idea what the highway code says. Now, don't pour water on me yet.
Got my
I'll be very, very blunt. Look at Afghanistan. I've got no intention to apologise for anything in Afghanistan. I apologise that we haven't shown more commitment, because we're in a situation in Afghanistan, the most barbaric, appalling individuals on this earth are about to seize power once again, the Taliban. Are you saying that we should simply stand back and say, oh no, we mustn't allow Western values to intervene there? Democracy, human rights, all those are Western values. Allow the Taliban to butcher and rape and kill many people? No, absolutely not.
Who was it that financed?
Okay,
Absolutely, I'm an internationalist. I believe in human rights. I will not stand idly by. I don't care what people say.
We are in Afghanistan because of a foolish American decision to respond to the Twin Towers by having an invasion. That's why we're in Afghanistan, and we made a bloody great mess of it. Created the Taliban in there.
And it should have been Saudi Arabia.
And we're ripping the harbour. We should have taken it to the International Criminal Court. We should have taken it to other Muslim countries, but we didn't. It was a criminal act that happened in New York, but we turned it into a war situation. And that's why we're in the mess there now.
The Taliban don't acknowledge human rights or international courts.
Yes, but we did train and
Absolutely wrong. I agree with you.
yes, yeah, we trained and financed the Taliban to get the Russians out.
Yeah.
That's what it was all about.
Yeah, exactly.
The Taliban, and he came bitten in the backside. That's why the Taliban's having control now.
So
Because we trained them and financed them.
So you sit back and do nothing.
What you said was the case.
Well, you were sitting back and doing nothing, and the rest of the world is doing nothing. You're doing nothing about fundamental Zionism against the Palestinians. You're all standing back, sucking your thumbs. There's only 264,000 Israelis living in this country, but they run it like Capitol Hill are running America. You're all afraid of them.
But it's anti-Zionist nonsense, and you
It's not anti-Zionist nonsense. You're scared to death of them.
rubbish.
You're scared to death.
I believe in a two-state
The only
solution
reason you
based
stop
on democracy and
if you wanted to stop the Iranians, stop
I'm not sure
Israel.
if people do.
Okay, so
Stop Israel, and you will stop the Iranians.
I would like to introduce a little bit of calm debate. Having lived in the South Caucasus and experienced Russian imperialism, I have great sympathy with many of the things that Wayne David has said. Having been to Saudi Arabia, worked in Africa, I have seen all sides of most problems. I've also been privileged to go to the UN and the Commission on the Status of Women. And my experience of all that teaches me that it is the way in which we constantly fight and contradict each other, as we have been this evening, instead of debating it logically. My perspective of many of the failures in the UN is the veto held by 5 countries. Are we prepared to give up that veto and allow countries like India and yes, Pakistan, China, Brazil, equal say in the solutions? And that means Russia standing down as well as the UK and the US. Yes, frankly.
I think that's not the only solution to the United Nations or to other problems. I personally am against the veto, but I don't think to abolish the veto tomorrow would suddenly bring in heaven on earth at all. But I think it would be a step forward. Why a country like ours, with 60 million people, has got a veto over countries with 250 million people without a veto, I don't understand. I don't think what the veto is for. So I think we should have a proper democratic UN in which the Security Council is a subdivision of the General Assembly, and the General Assembly operates in a democratic way. That's what I think should happen. We're a long way from it.
So how do we get there? Instead of
Well, you
just
join
throwing
the
up
UNA,
our
or you start talking about, you start writing letters, you start getting copies of the charter, you find out from the secondary schools here who's got any charters, what do they have in their educational system. You begin grassroots education about international affairs, which is absolutely missing.
I think all of us stand for democracy, freedom of speech, human rights. There's not one person in this room who doesn't stand for those values. The question is, how do we get there? And I think there's not a lot of evidence historically and in the current present time of interventionist policies working in delivering democracy and human rights. Can I just read off a few points that I wrote down because I didn't want to forget them. History is very important. If you go to somewhere like Iran, where my parents are from, In 1953, the CIA overthrew a democratically elected government in Iran. During the Iran-Iraq War, the US government gave chemical weapons to Saddam Hussein, which he used to attack the Iranian people. Even if 99% of Iranians tomorrow were for democracy and wanted to overthrow the regime, they wouldn't be in favour of it through proxy of the West. They'd want to do it themselves, and our involvement will be counterproductive in delivering that democracy in any case, even if the people believe in it. I say even if the people believe in it. The second point is there are many people in the Middle East, and I would say most people do not believe in democracy. So when you say we should intervene and help people to find a democratic solution in their country, the reality is a lot of people don't believe in that. Let me give you some examples. In Palestine, we gave democracy. They voted for Hamas. In Egypt, they voted for a Muslim Brotherhood. You know, to what extent does it work to just say, give these people a vote, and they will elect a democratic, secular, liberal country? I've never seen evidence of that, especially in recent times. Even when we intervene in civil wars, for example, every example I can think of in recent history, Islamists have made headway. In Libya, intervention, Islamists are now making headway. In Iraq, we intervene, Islamists are now making headway in Iraq. And the same is true of Syria. So what evidence is there that we can actually deliver this democratic, secular, liberal solution to the Middle East?
To have a democratic Middle East, although personally, I would like to see that. I think if you look at a country like Tunisia, for example, that's a good example where democracy is well established.
But we didn't intervene.
No, we didn't intervene. I think it is wrong for us. It certainly doesn't look in a practical sense, as we've seen in Libya, for us to go in and remove a dictator, no matter how bad he is, and expect democracy to naturally establish itself. There are always other forces at play, and I think that we need to understand that. The reality, however, sometimes is that it is better to allow a dictator to remain in place, even though it might be a dictator against best interests of a majority of the population, rather than have the absolute chaos and anarchy which has happened in some countries as a consequence of our intervention. I think that what we need to do above all else, I think, is rather than simply have our own predetermined ideas of what is democracy, as we did when we were cutting off the British Empire, and good models of democracy were what happens in the House of Commons, and we try to impose that in countries in East Africa in the last 5 minutes. What we need to do is be more understanding and aware of people's own traditions of democracy, and define democracy not in a Western way, but in a more general, liberal way. And I think if we look at Iraq is an artificial construct. It is created by the Western powers after the First World War. There's nothing natural about Iraq at all. And I think what we have failed to do in business is recognize not just the nature of the artificial boundaries, but the different cultural traditions and the different community groups which exist in Iraq. Shiites, in particular, have felt downtrodden against by the Sunnis for a long time. And we assume, therefore, that the Sunnis would obviously want some kind of democracy, Western Europe-style democracy. That was patently wrong. But I think that what I would say, however, is that most people in Iraq and Syria do not want the barbarism of ISIL. And I think that whatever we might say about non-intervention, I really don't think we can stand by idly and allow those kind of evil forces to actually run certain parts of our world and pretend that somehow we're internationalists and we care for fellow human beings. We've got a moral responsibility to fellow human beings to ensure understanding all the particularities and complications, that they have a right to determine their own form of government, their own way of life, and their right to live peaceably if they wish to do so. We have to defend that. That is a universal human value, surely.
defend mean? Is it a military operation, or is it using publicity, using human relations and contacts and talking about things and promoting things? Defend doesn't mean going to war, and nor are we in a position of such virtue, democratically, that we can lecture other countries. We aren't. We have an appalling system of democracy, first past the post, after constituents. No point putting up another party under the present arrangement that we have in this country. But I would just ask you, from I can understand your concern, let's look back on history and see the awful things that have happened in the past, which no longer happen because something has actually changed. Why can't we move forward? Do you think that Scotland was once a separate country with a bloodbath constantly between the English and the Scots? It's impossible. They played rugby together. I don't care what the SNP managed to achieve, but it's not going to be war on Northumberland. That's out. And so it goes for so many examples in history. Things move forward. All we can do is put our little sixpence in at the time and try to poke it in the right direction. And about 4 years ago, there was a man about to be executed in Tehran because he had said something against the Prophet or in favour of homosexuality or whatever. He was going to be executed. And the father because he'd murdered a boy, that's right, he murdered a boy over a sex row. And the man was going to be executed. And the father came forward and said, "This will not bring my boy back. Do not execute him. He can go to a prison sentence, but we do not want to run a country of vengeance." And I wrote, I never dreamt it would get there. I wrote via the Iranian embassy in London, and I got a letter, perfect letter back about a month later in English from the father of the man who had been murdered, saying, "Thank me for my compassionate concern." One little drop in the ocean, but we can all make those kind of bridges with other countries, personal as well as political, and start people thinking in different ways.
I think we're not looking reality in the face. Because reality in the face is that this month another boundary was passed. There was a summary execution of somebody with a drone. Now that's a boundary that's moved and it won't move back, because every time you open the door or move a boundary, you've done it. It doesn't go back. And talking about the UN charters of it, well, I have got the charter, I've read it. I've also read the Human Rights Charter. There are no countries in NATO that are altogether following that charter, because our human rights have been eroded all the time, and in Britain they're being eroded at the moment. So my hope is that the Labour Party or some other party or people in power will actually get it together to oppose what is happening in Britain to erode our democracy. And if Britain's democracy is eroded, I don't see how we can actually help in the world help to bring peace. Because peace will only come if you have rights where you are, then other people, where you're not, will have rights as well. But if we don't defend our own rights, then talking about anybody else's rights and what happens in the world is a waste of time.
But nobody's arguing about us not defending our rights. Of course, but let's look at them honestly. I'm dealing with a man from Algeria who came here in 2000, was given unconditional refugee status, unconditional. He was charged a year later with conspiracy to murder. All the jury let him off. He was not convicted. 6 months later, he was picked up under our terrorist legislation, and he's been in and out of prison since 2003, in and out, under constant threat of being sent back to Algeria, where he's going to go to prison if he goes back, and he's never had any knowledge of who's accused him or on what evidence. You wouldn't believe it in this country, Magna Carta, that you could be in prison for 15 years and not know who's accused you and what they've been accused of. They'd be embarrassed in Tehran, I think, if that kind of thing was. But that is happening in this country. So please let's not be too virtuous. I hope you know about this, because it is scandalous. Scandalous. Anybody who's touched with the terrorist brush, finish. There are no more any human rights. That's the reality that we are in this country now.
Member of the Shadow Justice team.
Really? Well, my dear friend, can we not? We're going to talk.
And you're absolutely right. One of the things that we are now desperately concerned about is the erosion of human rights in this country. The government wants to repeal the Human Rights Act. They want to withdraw Britain from the European Convention of Human Rights. And I think that is bad for people in this country, but it is bad for people in other countries as well. Because with all Britain's faults, Britain is seen as a good example. And you know, to go back to my friend Vladimir Putin, I mean, he's just relishing the fact that Britain might withdraw from conventional human rights, so he'd say, great, there's no need for me to acknowledge it anymore. So I mean, I think that's very, very important in an international sense, but also a domestic sense as well. Could I say just one final thing on law? It's a lot of people are not really aware of it, but we've all seen a massive erosion of legal aid in this country. And that is denying justice to literally millions of the least well-off people. But what a lot of people do not understand is that courts are actually charging people now for going to court as well. And a lot of people are not going to court because they can't afford to. What's happening in this country is that justice is only applicable to those who are rich. And that's absolutely despicable.
Check on that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just bringing us back to the topic.
I vote for a new chair, all right? People, rise up. Get rid of them. Go on.
Any further questions? Yes.
Yeah, just very, very simply, I want to put to you the attack on Russia from you. Regardless, there are problems in it. We understand that, and Russia's not perfect. But at the same time, it wasn't Russia that started this terrible chain of events in the world, with the Middle East now at the moment, which is absolutely spreading like wildfire. That wasn't Russia. That was a NATO-backed country, USA and Britain.
Yeah.
I agree. I think the war in Iraq was a disaster, and the war in Afghanistan before that was a disaster. But you know, how do we move forward is the issue that I'm concerned about. I think the gentleman in the back was talking about Israel. I completely agree. The partisan side we've taken over Israel, so that the 5th or 6th country to have nuclear weapons, you can't talk about it. Iran, you can say anything you like. Israel got a good, probably as many nuclear warheads as we've got, and it's completely beyond discussion. And I don't know why this conspiracy of silence in Britain there is about this. And it is a conspiracy of silence.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank God there are many Jewish groups very concerned and opposed to what's going on.
Absolutely.
They're not all Zionists by any means.
Yeah.
I had a quick question, if that's okay. I'm going to use my position again.
We'll discuss it.
Just coming back to some of the threats that there are, you've mentioned ISIL, we've talked, there's also threats of cyber security. Is there, and especially to groups, is there not a role for an organisation such as NATO, perhaps differently organised, in addressing those threats by sharing resources and working together?
Yeah, called the United Nations, and that's what NATO had a function. The function is no longer there. I think its function was genuine. But there are many other organisations within the network of the United Nations, got some 35 different subgroups that we should be dealing with. Climate change, human rights, education, minorities, it's all there in the UN. But we don't want to know about the UN. Who knows, who represents us at the United Nations now? Can anybody name the person who actually speaks for us at the United Nations? Anybody? Incredible. You know who the Prime Minister is, don't you? Yeah, Cameron. Who's our chap at the UN? We have no idea.
Question from someone who hasn't asked a question yet, so I'll ask you to speak.
Just a very quick question. I was wondering, obviously we would love a world with no nuclear weapons, where we're not constantly trying to blow each other up. But how can we guarantee that other countries will follow suit should we scrap our nuclear weapons, such as the Trident Seal? How can we guarantee that should a war break out in the future, we are not vastly underprepared? Because although we are powerful, we are a tiny little island, and there's no way, should all other countries have these weapons, that we would be able to defend.
So, how can we guarantee that other countries essentially
We can't can't guarantee what anybody else will do. We can just take me, there may be some homosexual maniac in this hall tonight who wants to assassinate me. Well, there we are. I can't do anything about it. So you can't always know what's going to happen, but you can take prudent steps in the right direction. And the most imprudent step is to spend £100 billion on this, in telling the world that without nuclear weapons we think we're defenceless for another 30 years, but you can't have them. You nignogs down there, you can't have them. That's basically what we're trying to do. And as long as you think nuclear weapons improve your security, then they're going to be a religion of nuclear weapons. The moment people realise that nuclear weapons are a threat, not a means to security, then they cease to have a value. No one today will be introducing white elephants and spending £100 billion on them. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, I'll let you come back, and then there's a question from the gentleman there.
I completely agree with that. Like, as I said, I think we would rather not have any at all, but we can't guarantee that other countries will follow our lead. We can't guarantee that they may have some underground corrupt system of nuclear weapons we don't know about.
They don't need to follow us. There are 170 countries that haven't got nuclear weapons.
No one is suggesting that we abandon the Army, Navy and Air Force in 5 minutes. But just as at one stage we had battleships no longer serve any function. We don't spend money on battleships. We had a Camel Corps once, one of the best in the world. No one is suggesting that we recreate the Camel Corps. It has no function. Chemical weapons. More up to date. Nobody said, here's a treaty. We said chemical weapons are no good, we got rid of them. There's the illusion of security and the reality of security. And the most of security is good relations with other people, not with threats on what they're going to do.
The world we live in is very unstable, and we've got to admit it. And as much as we don't want to, the world we live in is a dangerous world. And we've been going in this world for too long, thinking that, oh, it's so wonderful, oh, it's all fine, we can get rid of our nuclear weapons and nothing will happen to us. No, it will. And it's a reality that we need to face. This world is not nice, it is dangerous and it is unstable. And without nuclear weapons to protect ourselves, I'm sorry, but it could only be a few years and we could be gone. So is it not time that we actually get out of this dream that we seem to be living in and get into a reality that we need protection and we need security to protect ourselves in this world?
So every country should have nuclear weapons?
Well, it's a...
Thank you very much, yeah.
No, because it's...
But they're obsolete anyway, the Trident is obsolete.
Yes, but the point that I'm making is that if we were to leave, if I can finish, that if we leave NATO, we're going to be a country pretty much of our own, apart from Trident, and if we then get rid of Trident, which would probably follow up and leave from NATO, because it sort of all seems to be coming into the same classification, then we're going to be this lonely little island off of Europe that's going to be just vulnerable to attacks from people.
Sorry, can I let Ray respond first?
Somebody got to want to leave.
This is an active debate which we had in the Labour Party now.
And then
Okay, sorry, can we listen to the response? Thank you.
Can I put you an interesting scenario, right? And that is that if we had a Labour government led by Prime Minister Corbyn, he is against being a nuclear deterrent and that he is not prepared to press the button. In other words, then there's no point having nuclear weapons, they will be gone.
Yeah.
But he's also said that we should remain a part of NATO. So reality would be protected by France and American nuclear weapons, not the rule.
The very word protecting, that's the argument. You use that word, they always do. Protect means to protect. I think it puts us at greater risk, because if we will have other countries wanting nuclear weapons, they don't defend us. Nothing good. What can you do with the IRA and nuclear weapons? Any ideas? Nuke the IRA, destroy Belfast? It's absolute rubbish. They did not defend us against anything. They certainly don't defend us against ISIS, who don't care tuppence whether they fire nuclear weapons.
I mean, there's no such thing as an absolute pure democracy. But democracy, in my book, off the top of my head, is the ability to cast your vote by whatever system every so often without being impeded or instructed how to vote. But it's also, democracy is about freedom of speech. This is democracy. Long may it continue. And I think it's being able to say things freely and openly is part of a democratic society. The other thing I'd say is a democracy, inherent to democracy, is the respect you have of other people's point of view as well, too. Because nobody is ever absolutely right. There's always a counter-argument. And democracy, it should provide the framework for frank and honest discussion to take place. And freedom of speech, I think, is absolutely essential, as is freedom of the press. Not simply, the people who got the most money can have the most newspapers. That's not real democracy. But it's been able to express itself whatever means possible to enhance the democratic process and be able to cast your vote in whatever elections without fear or favour. That's democracy.
But I'd just like to add to that. Yes, I think we have got on the scale of democracy, we're quite high up the thermometer. There are other countries, I suppose, Costa Rica and others, where I'd say there was a higher level of democracy. But we are quite high up the ladder. But what people don't notice is the right to a free vote depends on the information you receive.
Yeah.
In this country, we are under a media control which serves up millions of lies weekly, daily to people. And that is the information on which they will cast their vote. And that is a problem for me. The democracy, it must control information, must have honest information, as well as the right to participate. But we can all be democratic. Maybe you're members of trade unions or of churches or women's groups. Go and do something. You don't have to wait for the government to do so. That's what I thought today. We handed in this petition about the conscientious objectors. Well, why are we handing in a petition? Just go and do it. 15th of May is the major international conscientious objectors day. Wales has got a wonderful tradition of refusing military service. Wonderful. Get on with it. Make a big thing of it.
Thank you very much, Greg. Any closing comments from either of you before we...
Yeah, God bless you, my child.
Okay.
Can I say finally?
Yeah.
And as I kicked off, but we talk about democracy. What is important, and I think what has been lacking generally in this country for a good many years, is a frank and open discussion about these sorts of issues. And it's wonderful to see so many people here, and it must continue, right?
Yeah, even if you're wrong.
Yeah.